You guys remember back in October last year, we had some fur baby debacles where my 12-year-old stepdaughter was accused of being a bully because one of her classmates was making animal noises in their group chat and it annoyed them. So they said that if she didn't knock it off, they were going to call animal control. Well, fast forward to almost April now, and we have some new developments. Welcome back, Season 2, Episode 1, new set, new content. I'm actually going to focus in on getting into the legalese that you never want to read, nor should you, and make this a little bit more digestible so you understand why courts do what they do instead of just regurgitating headlines and nobody understanding how these headlines came to be. In line with that, I'll dive into some more substance on the fur babies as we move forward, but in case you weren't aware of what I'm talking about or you didn't see my post from last October, here's a little refresher.
Present landed on my lap this morning. This is gold. My friend Mike Yoder tweeted, is it still a tweet or is it X? He X'd. Stepdaughter's school taught them to accept others and treat them as they identify. Her and her friends listened. Today they were pulled out of class and had their phones searched for bullying a classmate that identifies as a fur baby. Excuse me, but asking he, she, they, their, zim, te, tear, or ver about rabies is fair game when you identify yourself as an animal. Yoder's a lawyer, so he clapped back with this. I write in regard to your spectacularly cavalier decision to initiate an investigation into a group of 6th grade students simply because they privately discussed their concerns about possibly contracting a dangerous and often fatal disease while in your care. San Diego County ranks 6th for cases of rabies contraction in the entire state. Because many furry species, including dogs, wolves, bats, raccoons, skunks, and even woodchucks, are some of the most common rabies carriers, it is quintessential to know the fur baby species to ensure these young girls can reasonably ascertain the magnitude of their risk of exposure to a potentially fatal disease during school hours. Made clear during the COVID-19 pandemic, even those with numerous vaccinations can often still contract fatal illness. I trust no further communication is needed and that you will act accordingly. I'm gonna need an update come Monday morning. I'm proud of you, Yoder.
So unfortunately, they never responded to my earlier letter, and I still don't have a copy of that animals on campus policy. But I do have an update, and now I've learned that the fur babies, those wolves, dogs, and foxes, are allowed to wear their tails during gym class, but my stepdaughter is not allowed to wear her Christian cross. I'm just as confused as you probably are on this, but I'm going to figure out why, and I can promise you that she'll be wearing her Christian cross if she so chooses during gym class. That'll be the next update once we get there, but the reason I'm telling you guys this story is because the most logical question that you probably have, or if you don't, you should have, is why the hell are schools doing this? Like, it makes no sense at face value, and it's kind of confusing. But here's the answer to that. The reason that schools are pushing these agendas, the reason that they're allowing this to happen, is because of history and tradition, and the fact that our rights are based off of historical tradition the vast majority of the time. We've all heard what fundamental rights are, but no one ever defines what's fundamental. Roll it back 15 years ago when you had a BlackBerry. Was it essential? Was it something fundamental to being a businessman? Probably. What about dial-up internet, cable TV, all these things that we used to have that were integral to our society, that were fundamental, that everyone had, that were ways of life, that were part of our culture? They're no more. They don't exist anymore. And that's what they're trying to do with conservative values. They're trying to destroy nuclear families. They're trying to push agendas of just sheer idiocracy. And it doesn't just apply to schools. It applies in contexts of guns. It applies in contexts of religion. How is it that that illegal immigrant in Chicago is able to be held as a matter of law to have a Second Amendment right to own and carry a firearm? Well, it's because of history and tradition. They said that there's no historical tradition of laws regulating illegal immigrants having firearms in this country, which is just abjectly wrong, frankly. I mean, there's a law in I think it was 1794 in Pennsylvania that prohibited Indians from owning guns. There's a law in the 1800s from Missouri, same concept. The problem here, though, is it's a double-edged sword, because if anyone cites those laws, you're going to be called a racist. And yes, those laws were racially motivated. I'm not someone that was around in the 1700s to have supported or opposed those laws. I'm just simply saying, well, we do have a history or a tradition of those laws. And that's the problem, because if you cite these things, it gets spun against you as saying that you somehow still support those things, as opposed to just objectively pointing out what the law says. You're looking at history and tradition. Well, that's what our law says. Now, along with that, we do have a series of cases throughout our country's history that are just disgusting. And our Supreme Court and other courts have made terrible decisions. I mean, look at Plessy versus Ferguson. It wasn't until the 60s with Brown v. Board where they desegregated schools, something that was long overdue. Same thing with Korematsu, is a case dealing with the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II simply because they were Asian. Another disgusting decision. But those decisions that stain our history are also part of our history. And what they're trying to do is weaponize it in a way where you can't argue in favor of something that's a standard that will get you attacked for arguing in the first place. And that's what they're trying to do with children. That's what they're trying to do with guns. If you fight and oppose guns long enough, then eventually you're not going to have gun rights anymore. How do you think abortion came to become a right? And abortion, by the way, is the one right that will never, ever, ever be able to be resolved, because the only three rights that you have enumerated in the actual text of the Constitution, not the Bill of Rights, the text of the Constitution, are life, liberty, and property. If you go back and look at the history of this, in the 60s, you had the first case, Griswold v. Connecticut. It was dealing with contraceptives and whether a married couple could have contraceptives. In the state of Connecticut, it wasn't legal. The Connecticut legislature was a predominantly Christian legislature at the time, and their theory and the philosophy behind it was, if you're married and you engage in intercourse, well, then the purpose of that is to procreate. If God wants you to have a child, then so be it. You should have a child. You shouldn't interfere with that. Well, they challenged that, and the court struck that regulation down, prohibiting contraceptives to married couples. Well, the next case turns out, well, what if you're not married? Okay, well, yeah, that's not right too, because we have to treat everyone equally and we can't discriminate based on marital status. Well, i.e., there you go, how you got a protected class for marriage. And then from there, well, if all people are treated equally, what about minors? Shouldn't minors be able to have contraceptives? Well, implicit in that is also the notion that minors are engaging in sex, which is something that you shouldn't, in my opinion, I don't think is something that should be advertised, let alone, something that's advocated for. But there's a money-making machine behind that. Planned Parenthood was booming at the time. And then all of a sudden you start to see their rights degrade and roll downhill. They just start to snowball because there's a slippery slope in there somewhere. And as I was saying, the reason that abortion can never be resolved is because the fundamental right to liberty and the fundamental right to life, abortion is the only circumstance in which those two things coexist at the end, but not at the start. Meaning, prior to conception, there's a mother's fundamental right to liberty, and the notion of that liberty right is found in the question of, can you have liberty if you don't have privacy? And that goes back to the question based on whether the government can regulate what you do in the bedroom, which is, between a married couple, it's the most intimate thing you can have. There's nothing quintessentially more private than engaging in intimacy with your spouse. But if the government can regulate you in the bedroom, do you have any liberty if there's no privacy? And what's more of a private matter than that? Well, I genuinely believe that no, you can't have liberty without privacy. But this is a slippery slope, because where does the line get crossed? Everyone can follow that progeny, right? You can see that you can't have liberty without privacy. Therefore, the government shouldn't regulate the bedroom on the contraceptive issue. Then it turns into the next issue, which is, what about unmarried couples? Yeah, we can agree that that's probably wrong, that if you're married, you can get contraceptives, but if you're not married, you can't. Well, then what's difference about a minor when the Constitution protects all life? It doesn't set an age limit as to when you get this right. That right comes to be from when you're born. And if you don't agree with that, then how can you claim that abortion isn't lawful because it threatens the mother's right to, again, liberty? Because if you can't regulate what happens in the bedroom on the front end, why can you now regulate it on the back end when it's the consequence that results from engaging in the same exact conduct? So you can see that slippery slope, and somewhere along the lines it gets gray. But there's not a clear answer other than the fact of when you disagree with the policy interest. And the reason abortion can never be resolved is because at the time that the act is engaged in, the mother's fundamental right to liberty is implicated. However, thereafter, the baby's fundamental right to life is also implicated. And the baby cannot have its fundamental right to life protected while at the same time the mother's liberty interest is also protected. They can't coexist if a mother so chooses that she wants to have an abortion. And that's the reason that you can never have an answer to that question, because you can't satisfy both at the same time when, by definition, the mother's exercise of her right to liberty, if she's a pro-choice person, is to eliminate the unborn child's right to life. So the philosophical question comes down to, when does life begin? That's why we've had a progeny of cases dealing with Roe v. Wade. We've had Planned Parenthood v. Casey. And fortunately now we've had some sense talked into our justices with the Dobbs decision. And Dobbs didn't outlaw abortion. It just said that it's not something that the federal government's going to regulate, and they left it up to the states. And the states, 27 of them, had statutes that said if there is no federal right to this anymore, then we automatically revoke it and pull our abortion laws off the books. Well, that's what happened when the Supreme Court came down with it. But instead of getting mad at the federal government, all they said was, we're not going to regulate it. So people don't understand that. People don't understand the way it works, and that's why they need to pay attention to what's going on with history and tradition. Same thing if you look at the case between Lawrence v. Texas. 12 years later, you have Obergefell v. Hodges. In 2003, prior to then, it was a crime in Texas to engage in homosexual sodomy. A gentleman was arrested. They had a warrant for his arrest, broke into his house. He happened to be gay, and he happened to be doing gay things when they came inside. And no, I guess no pun intended. And his fellow friend also was arrested for doing those things. And it took all the way up to the Supreme Court before they said that it was an unconstitutional statute to criminalize homosexual sodomy. Yet 12 years later, gay marriage is legalized nationwide. So when you think about how quickly this can happen, and then you look at what we're going through right now with the attack on guns, the attacks on free speech, the attacks on our First Amendment rights to freedom of religion, the nuclear family, faith in God, education and Christianity being promoted, not attacked. I mean, you can see where it's going. And why would they not start targeting kids? Because if you can start attacking kids, then you can set the seed very, very early on. And if kids don't care about it, it's only a matter of time until the masses, likewise, don't care about certain things that we do care about. And that's because they don't know any different, and that's because they don't know any better, because the entire education market and the media have been cornered with these leftist agendas. So going back to where I started this whole thing about the fur babies, it's just one isolated instance and one individualized example of how they can just pervert our entire culture in an attempt to eradicate it. And that's where we are today. And that's why every single opportunity you have to oppose culture, shifts and cultural norms that are just being desecrated, you have to. You can't say, oh, it's just a small instance, or oh, it's just this, or oh, it's just that. Because every time that you say that, they're moving the ball forward towards their objective of eradicating the culture that you know of, the things that were important to you, the family values, the Christian-based philosophies, and just the influence. And I don't know a single person that would prefer to live in a culture that we have today over a culture that we had back in the 20s, 30s, even the 60s. I mean, the 70s, the worst thing was, you had psychedelics. 80s was metal and hair bands. 90s, not much happened other than Bill Clinton and Monica. I mean, if you really look at our historical culture, it wasn't bad. I mean, 90s, early 90s, if you were born any later than that, you don't even know what a normal childhood is. You don't remember getting stuck in a thunderstorm, having to go, hope that you were able to find a phone or knock on someone's door and you were able to call your parents because you memorized it. You didn't even need to know the area code. You played outside all day. You didn't have cell phones. You weren't on the computer or on the internet. Those days are over, and they're never coming back. And the same thing is going to happen with your rights if you allow them to continue to desecrate what we see as normal. So when you take a stand, it's not just doing it out of futility, it's doing it out of principle, because there is actually a purpose, and it's to preserve historical traditions and norms. Because once we lose our rights, and once we change what we deem fundamental as a society, the rights that we know of are never coming back. And that's a scary, scary thought, especially when they're attacking things like religion, speech, and our ability to prevent a tyrannical government from taking us over with the Second Amendment.